How did Ayn Rand express her view of what is good and evil in human society through her works of fiction? That's what we're discussing today in the new intellectual book study. I'm Cody Leibold, and we are looking at the short fictional character speeches in Ayn Rand's novels. They are helpfully collected in her book for the new intellectual. Now, in my version of the book, this will be pages 60 through 76 today. So the speeches included are going to be from several novels: We the Living, a novelette called Anthem, and then The Fountainhead. And in The Fountainhead, these will be the short speeches. There's a short speech by Rourke, and there's a short one by Ellsworth Toohey. And then if you stick around for next session, we'll be doing an entire week devoted to The Fountainhead's longest speech, which will be Howard Rourke's courtroom speech. And then after that, there will be a whole bunch of speeches in Atlas Shrugged. So they saved the Atlas Shrugged speeches, and especially John Galt's speech. These are all short. And so as we read each of these speeches, I will be giving a little introduction to what the book was, so you know who's talking. Picking up on page 60 in the novel We the Living, this was Ayn Rand's first published novel, published in 1936. And the theme is the individual against the state, we read. The supreme value of a human life and the evil of the totalitarian state that claims the right to sacrifice it. The story takes place in Soviet Russia. The main character is Kira. She has been having a love affair with Andrei in order to obtain money to save the life of Leo Kovalensky, the man she loves. Andrei, an idealistic young communist who is profoundly in love with her, was beginning to discover the importance of personal values when, in the course of arresting Leo for a political crime, he learns the truth about Kira's relationship to both of them. So here she is confronted by him. And she's going to make a case to him about, hey, this is how I have lived my life. I believe that values are individual. In light of everything else you've learned from the things that we've done at FTNCI, you can see we would agree with her perspective here, that the individual must have personal interest in the choices that he makes. And that's one of the reasons we reject collectivism and totalitarianism, because it removes from consideration the individual's interests, and it treats the collective as if the collective is the thing that has interests. So metaphysically, it's wrong. Now, this is the emotional speech of somebody who has just realized that she's wrecked somebody's life. But she's giving her explanation of why she did what she did. The doctor said he was going to die, and I loved him. You've learned what that means, too, haven't you? He didn't need much, only rest and fresh air and food. He had no right to that, had he? Your state said so. We tried to beg, we begged humbly. Do you know what they said? There was a doctor in a hospital, and he said he had hundreds on his waiting list. Skipping ahead, hundreds, thousands, millions of what? Stomachs, and heads, and legs, and tongues, and souls. And it doesn't even matter whether they fit together, just millions, just flesh. Human flesh. And it, had been registered and numbered. You know, like tin cans on a store shelf. I wonder if they are registered by the person or by the pound. And they had a chance to go on living, but not Leo. He was only a man. So this is the reality of life in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. So then I skip ahead a couple sentences. This is Kira speaking. She says, there was a big commissar, and I went to see him. He told me that 100,000 workers had died in the Civil War, and why couldn't one aristocrat die in the face of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics? And her response to that is, and what is the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics in the face of one man? You can see the comparison of two worldviews, the individualistic worldview and the collectivistic one. She goes on, she says, I'm grateful to that commissar. He gave me permission to do what I have done, which was, she was using Andrei, the Soviet officer, she was using him for money, all in order to save the life of the one that she actually loved. So skipping several sentences down, she says, how do you like it, Comrade Andrei Taganov of the All-Union Communist Party? If you taught us that our life is nothing before that of the state, well then, are you really suffering? She says, why don't you say that one's own life doesn't really matter? You loved a woman, and she threw your love in your face. But the proletarian mines in the Don Basin have produced 100 tons of coal last month. Skipping a bit, she says, why don't you smile and sing hymns to the toil of the collective? It's still there, your collective. Go and join it. Did anything really happen to you? Then she says, don't you have something greater left to live for? Or do you, Comrade Taganov? Look at me. Take a good look. I was born, and I knew I was alive, and I knew what I wanted. She says, why do you think I'm alive? Because I have a stomach and eat and digest the food? Because I breathe and work and produce more food to digest? Or because I know what I want? That something which knows how to want, isn't that life itself? Skipping ahead, she says, but you've tried to tell us what we should want. You came as a solemn army to bring a new life to men. You tore that life you knew nothing about out of their guts, and you told them what it had to be. Skipping, she says, you came and you forbade life to the living. You've driven all of us into an iron cellar, and you've closed all the doors. You've locked us airtight. Airtight till the blood vessels of our spirits burst. Then you stare, and you wonder what it's doing to us. Well, then look, all of you who have eyes left, look. So that's her speech. Now, if you've read the story, I'm not going to spoil the end of the story, but this is a major pivot point in the story. This is where the fates of various characters all become much more clear because of what's happened here. And this is a good example of writing a plot story like Ayn Rand advocates. It's a romantic realist story, the kind of story that could happen, but that has characters that are larger than life. And you notice that the theme of the story works itself exactly into this plot point. So that's an interesting feature of Rand's work, is that when people make a speech like this, it tells you what's going to happen to all the characters based on the logic of what's happened before and what their choices have been. So that's some of the themes that I see in there. One, she says that you've locked us up airtight. One of the possible names that Rand considered using for this novel was airtight, because actually she grew up in Soviet Russia, and she tried to escape, and she succeeded in escaping. Her character here, Kira, is in a similar position, attempting to escape from life in Soviet Russia. And it was as if all of the air had been sucked out, and as if everybody was locked in. That's what it was like at that time. We need to be looking at people as individuals. Liberty matters, and what's happened in the Russian state is that you're only a number. And if it's not in the best interest of the collective, then we cannot promise you that you're going to have access to healthcare or anything. So I'm curious, have you guys read this novel? Have you any familiarity with it? This would be her, out of the 4 novels that Rand wrote, which would be Atlas Shrugged, Fountainhead, We the Living, this one, and Anthem, this would be the one that is usually the least celebrated of them. It's a good story, but it's not on the level of the other 3, in my opinion, as a work of art. But it is the most autobiographical of all of Ayn Rand's works. The spirit of this person who's speaking, this is the spirit of Ayn Rand's own character, if you were to think about that. Any interactions with what we've read on that, or comparisons to the kinds of things that we see happening in the rest of the world or in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think we definitely see the formula of, a human being regarded as just a number rather than being regarded as an individual. Right here it says basically all he needed was he needed a break. He needed fresh air, he needed food, and he just needed to be able to rest. And, the state said, no, you can't, you don't get to have any rest. So it just seems like this is what we see time and time again in these collectivist utopias. We're promised, quite a lot. We're promised that everything's going to be rainbows and gumdrops, and that's not how it ever turns out. It ends up being where man is just a slave to the state.
I would point out that in the United States, we currently have a movement towards socialized medicine, and that's one of the things that you see is, they talk about, are there going to be death panels? If you look in the UK, I think that about a year back, the person who is the very top person in charge of the UK's medical system, which is the most socialized system out of, if you were to compare, say, Canada, United States, Great Britain, the very top person was not even able to get medical care for what she needed. And I think she might have died. I'd have to look up the details, but it's one of those situations where if she had lived in the United States, she could have received care, but they had lines and quotas, and she wasn't able to in the system that she was in charge of. She wasn't able to get what she needed to live. Go ahead, Greg.
See, I do remember somebody saying, and it might have been your own Brooke, but don't quote me on that. I think somebody said that, in the UK, they regard, the socialized healthcare system as being basically almost like a religion, and you don't dare question it. And I guess for young people, like if you want to go to a store and get an aspirin, or go get some very basic medicine, it's free, and they think that's great. But if you actually need something, and you're a wealthy person, what you end up doing is flying to the United States. So if you need surgery, you're not going to rely on their socialist system. You're going to fly to the United States, where we have a much freer, though hardly free, system of medicine.
And where is the innovation taking place? Where are doctors actually developing new technologies? It's in the United States. Where do doctors go, even if they're born in Great Britain, if they want to have a good career? Where do they go? They go to the U.S. So it's a brain drain situation, and it's not tenable long range. And so eventually, I think that what's going to happen in the United States is they're going to try to imitate what happened in the UK. It's a sad situation.
Could I just comment briefly and say what this reminds me of? A recent speech that was shared widely by Giorgia Meloni, the new, I believe, Prime Minister of Italy. We'd obviously have some disagreement or some concerns about her, I think, but at the same time, she echoed that thought, that loss of the individual into the collective in this kind of totalitarian system, where in a recent speech she had said that identity is under attack. I must not be able to define myself as an Italian Christian female mother. No, I must be citizen X, parent 1, parent 2. I must be a number. Because when I'm only one number, when I no longer have an identity, when I have no more roots, well, then I will be the perfect slave at the mercy of the great financial speculators and the perfect consumer. And we are here to say we are not numbers. We will defend the value of the human person, of each single human person. And I thought it was that's incredibly relevant to the initial few sentences of the excerpt you read, that she wonders if human beings are registered like tin cans on a store shelf.
It definitely makes me think of how China is treating its citizens. It has been for the last several years, especially in light of the COVID lockdowns. And that's exactly the issue of the lockdowns. There's a striking parallel between the idea of the lockdowns and the idea of airtight, what Rand has been describing. If you compare the approach to government that says the government does have total control over its citizens' lives, and it can tell them, even if they have no proof that the person has the disease or has been exposed to the disease, it can tell them that they are forced to lock down and stay still. Well, compare that to what you would see in the Bible. Do you see anything in the Bible showing that would be the king or the judge's role? That would be something that the government should have any influence on. So that should strike you. If you're a Christian leader, especially, like if your name is Brad Littlejohn or Aaron Wren, or if you're one of these guys that calls themselves conservatives but is in favor of the state growing, you have to ask yourself, do you have any basis in our religion for that? And of course, do you have any basis in common sense and logic for that either?
Mind if I jump in there real quick, Cody?
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So I know I've already commented a lot this morning, but, when you talk about quarantine, like, I gotta jump in. You look at the Old Testament, and what we see with quarantine in the Old Testament is if somebody was sick, if they had a skin disease, they were supposed to go outside of the camp. So the person who was sick was supposed to separate themselves from the group. And, if a house had what's translated as like a leprosy, but it's not necessarily leprosy like we would think of it. If a house had an infection, then, the house was destroyed. So what we actually see in the Bible in terms of isolating disease, in terms of separating disease away from the healthy, it was millennia ahead of medical knowledge. The idea of quarantining people and separating the sick from the healthy like we do today, like we take for granted. This was not properly understood by modern science until I believe it was around the mid-1800s.
Thanks for adding that. That's some helpful context. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and the reading to Anthem. This will be the more challenging of the readings this week because some of the things in here are so much related to the question of personal interest and motivation, and they would touch on the question of as Christians, if we read it, what's our relationship to God? Are we being irreverent by saying, I am my own purpose, for instance? So that's what this is about. So Anthem is a short work. It's far shorter than the other ones, and it's more poetic in its structure. The novelette was first published in England in 1938. Its theme is the meaning of man's ego. It projects a society in the future which has accepted total collectivism with all its ultimate consequences. Men have relapsed into primitive savagery and stagnation. The word I has vanished from the human language. There are no singular pronouns. A man refers to himself as we, and another man as they. The story presents the gradual rediscovery of the word I by a man of intransigent mind. The following excerpt is from his statement about his discovery. This would be at the climax of the story. So he says, I am, I think, I will. When you read those words, it's after reading an entire story where he's always referred to himself as we. And all of a sudden, and they're journal entries. So it's like in a movie, sometimes, you see like there's somebody that did an audio journal or a video journal, and it skips ahead to another one. And so there's time that's progressed. And then all of a sudden, you open up to this next chapter, and it says, I am, I think, I will. And you realize he's figured out the secret. He's figured out philosophically what happened to the collectivist society when it abandoned the concept of I. And if you notice, I am, I think, I will, he has now discovered, by those words, he has discovered a philosophical outlook. He's discovered metaphysics. I am. He's discovered epistemology. I think. He's discovered ethics. I will. So that's the meaning of that statement. So he says, I am, I think, I will. What must I say besides? These are the words. This is the answer. Skipping ahead, he says, I wished to know the meaning of things. I am the meaning. There's a strong Nietzschean sound to that, isn't there? And there's also a strong egoist sound to that. So we can discuss that. But he says, I am the meaning. He says, I wished to find a warrant for being. I need no warrant for being, and no word of sanction upon my being. I am the warrant and the sanction. So in the context of Rand's thought, I would say this is pushing back against the collectivism that we've already seen. In the context of Christian thought, nobody would say, I need no sanction, because we do have a perfect moral authority in God. So this is clearly not Christian in its outlook. Nevertheless, I can appreciate what it is doing, which is pointing out that there is in man something divine. Christianity teaches that. So if that's the case, then there is something in here that is pushing back against an error accurately, even if it's not advocating its own position with accuracy. All right, let's go on. This man writes, I know what happiness is possible to me on earth, and my happiness needs no higher aim to vindicate it. My happiness is not the means to any end. It is the end. It is its own goal. It is its own purpose. It sounds a lot like hedonism, doesn't it? So Rand's understanding of ethical philosophy may not have been as developed here as it was when she wrote The Fountainhead later and when she wrote Atlas Shrugged. Some people have commented that this sounds like it could be ambiguous whether she is an objective egoist or whether she is a subjective egoist. Is she simply saying, I feel it, therefore it's true, or I want it, therefore it's good? Is that what she's saying here? I don't think so, but it's not quite as disambiguated as her future works would be. Nevertheless, this idea that your happiness is not the means to any end, but it is the end, that can be integrated with a robust philosophical understanding. When Rand talks later on in her more developed thought about ethics, she says that every ethical code, it has to answer questions such as what is the standard of value and what is the purpose of value, and who is the recipient of value. And in those categories, we discussed that in the Objectivism book study, the standard of value is man's life. The purpose is his own life and his own happiness. His happiness is the means by which he experiences the attainment of his values. And so his life is the standard, His happiness is the purpose. She uses those two terms very carefully. She wouldn't cross them. The standard of what your values should be is what is required for rational life on earth. But the purpose is your own life on earth. And so when you've answered those two questions, then automatically you've answered the third question. Who's the beneficiary of correct moral action? It is the individual. So that's how this fits in with Rand's overall philosophical system. Personal interest matters. You should have a personal interest in the things that you choose. And ultimately, it comes back to, why did I choose it? So for example, if somebody says, what's the most important thing? You might say the answer as a Christian is to glorify God. Yeah, glorifying God is the most important thing. We know from the Westminster Confession of Faith, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. And as John Piper says, chief end of man, that implies that there's only one. But then why does it say to glorify God and enjoy him forever? That implies that glorifying God and enjoying him forever are one idea. And so the point that Piper has made is we should glorify God by enjoying him forever. They must be connected. So instead of and, he switches the word to by. And I would just argue that it would be just as fair to say it in the other order. Chief end of man would be to enjoy God forever by glorifying him. They mean the same thing. They're referring to the same thing in reality. And so I don't think that there's anything inconsistent or unbiblical about Piper's view on what he calls Christian hedonism. I wouldn't say hedonism is the most felicitous name, but rather it's the objectivity of values, and objectivity requires a relationship between the person and reality. And if you try to separate away and say that there's no relationship between the person and reality, between his choice, his volitional choice to accept the values and reality, you get a problem. And that's why people have tried to speak of values as intrinsic, apart from people. Whereas the Ayn Rand view, the objectivist view of values, is that there's always a relationship between the valuer and the valued thing. And the very concept of value necessitates encompassing both. And it necessitates encompassing choice, at least for beings like us that have choice. So all of that is just a little background to understand what is being said here. My happiness needs no higher aim to vindicate it. Now that said, we can vindicate somebody's choice, say to be a Christian, by saying it pleases God. That's one good reason for it. He did create the person. He does own the person. Whatever pleases God will be the right answer. But what is the personal interest in pleasing God? Is there one? And I think there needs to be. And anytime we separate personal interest from pleasing God, we're in danger of diminishing the meaning of love. Imagine saying to God, I love you, but I don't have a personal interest in you. That you've just contradicted the concept of love. We have a lot more material about this at FTNCI. You can look at our old videos about egoism, about divine egoism, Christian egoism. But the overall point would be, think about in 1 Corinthians, where it says, if I do all these good things, but I have not love, I'm a resounding cymbal, clanging gong. That tells us that love consists of something more than just the outward actions. Love consists of a disposition towards something. Having a personal stake and value in somebody is required for love. Otherwise, it's just hypocrisy. And so to that purpose, I would say that what Rand is saying here is useful. If it could at least remind us that there are errors that we must avoid. Any interactions on that so far?
Yeah, I think that's helpful in clarifying a bit what she was getting at. Because there's definitely, in reading this, I thought there's definitely a sense in which I completely affirm all of this, and then there's another sense in which I wouldn't agree with it, depending on what she's getting at, knowing a bit of her philosophy. And as you've explained it, that confirms, yeah, I do agree with that. I just think it's fascinating in teaching our kids to memorize some basic scripture. It was going through the first and greatest commandment, teaching them to, or the second that's like it rather, love your neighbor as yourself. There's so many there's so many things that are often overlooked in that commandment. Number one being that, first of all, it's love your neighbor, not love humanity, right? It goes back to that old statement about how progressives love humanity but not human beings. And it specifically says love your neighbor as yourself. Secondly, it's about the neighbor, which means there's some amount of proximity that implies responsibility there. That it's not a generic love other people, it's love your neighbor. And so, and we see that consistently throughout Scripture, that, it's a nice thing to do, to give to the church that's in another area of the Roman Empire. But if you're not taking care of your own family, then you're worse than an infidel. There's a greater responsibility for those in greater proximity to you. And thirdly, Jesus could have ended his sentence with love your neighbor. He didn't. He said, as yourself, which almost seems to assume a love of self as not just a prerequisite, but a necessity for loving your neighbor. And that did not need to be in there, but he included it, I believe, as a recognition of something that should be an assumption, but in our incredibly depraved age, we need reminded of, that loving yourself as made in the image of God is something that's assumed in Scripture, rather than something that should have to be taught. We're talking, like, as Paul says, we're going beyond the milk, when we should be ready for solid food. We have to go even further back to remind ourselves of things that human beings should simply know by basic observation. But worldviews today are such that they're strip mining, they're digging away at the source code of reality, and we have to fix that in many ways.
Yeah, somebody might read Scripture and they might ask, why didn't they explain this whole thing about rational egoism and personal interest? And the answer is, nobody was attacking personal interest 2,000 years ago in the way that they are today. Go ahead, Greg.
It's amazing, because before I discovered FTNCI, or rather was introduced to it, the idea of egoism being a good thing wasn't even on my radar. So I would read the book of Proverbs and almost find it strange, because it seemed so self-interested. And it's funny, because like, you read something like this, you read something, Ayn Rand talking about I, and having this story where people rediscover the word I, and having these ideas that somebody's main priority in their life is their own rational self-interest. And you have something where you have Jesus coming along saying, love your neighbor as yourself. At first, that almost seems like a contradiction. It almost seems like these are two separate things. But as you delve into both ideas more deeply, you look more at what the Bible says, and you look more at what Ayn Rand said, the two aren't necessarily saying different things. Ayn Rand still wanted to respect the rights of her neighbor. If you read, Atlas Shrugged, and you read the speech from the 20th guy from the 20th Century Motor Company, he said that, hey, when one of our buddies had a baby, or when his wife had a baby, we would pass around, a collection and, give to the guy. And it wasn't by compulsion, it was out of genuinely caring for the person. So it's like, she wasn't totally opposed to charity. It was that when you give charity, when you give to another person, it should extend from a genuine compassion for that person. So, I might not be saying everything exactly the way she would have put it, or, in the exact terminology, but at the end of the day, like, these two things line up a lot more than I think people realize.
That's well said. Let me go forward in the reading. So we've just picked up where he says, my happiness is not the means to any end. It is the end. It is its own goal. It is its own purpose. Now he says, neither am I the means to any end others may wish to accomplish. I am not a tool for their use. That ability to say no, that's consistent with what you see in John Galt. He says, I swear by my life and my love of it, I will never live for the sake of any other man, or ask any other man to live for my sake. He says, I owe nothing to my brothers, nor do I gather debts from them. Okay, so that's an interesting idea of not owing anything to anyone else. Does that sound like anything that you guys have read before? Anything in, say, Romans 13? Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another, for whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. And you could look at that that's Romans 13:8. Maybe we'll look at it in a couple of other translations to see some of the different shades of the meaning possible here. In the English Standard, it says, owe no one anything except to love each other. In King James, owe no man anything. New American Standard, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. That's an interesting idea. It doesn't seem like, if you grew up in church, you come across that verse and you might think, well, wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to be our brother's keeper and stuff like that. This idea of not owing things to other people, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on it. Is it saying just don't get in debt? Or is it saying that you don't need to feel a moral obligation to other people? Well, if you look at the previous context to it, it's talking about submission to authorities. It's talking about paying taxes. So the immediate context would suggest that we're talking about what your obligation is to other people. Because if you go to verse 5, this is in the NIV once more. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So he's talking about a moral category here. He says this is why you pay taxes. So from the moral category of your obligations to others, then it comes an outward action. This is why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, some people will say, well, Cody, don't you think taxation is theft? Well, I think that it's morally necessary to pay taxes. Okay? So that's one point. I do not think that it is the right of anyone to put me in jail if I don't pay taxes. Now, I can hold those two things and they do not contradict each other. So, in other words, I believe that the governing authorities should tell us what it costs to do what they're doing, and they should send us a bill. And that it would be wrong for them to put me in jail or to close my bank account if I don't pay. But it would not necessarily be wrong for them to post a public sign that says Cody Leibold never paid his bills. You see, so there's social pressure that can be used on people in order to require them to pay taxes. But anyway, I get to this point here in the reading in Romans 13. He was talking about paying respect and honor, and then it goes right into the next verse. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. So you compare that to what we've just read here. I owe nothing to my brothers, nor do I gather debts from them. He has a very similar outlook to what Paul is expressing. And then we go on. He says, I ask none to live for me, nor do I live for any others. Okay, I want you guys to compare 1 Corinthians chapter 9. At the end of that section, and this is in the New American Standard, he says, verse 24, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. He writes, compare that to what is said here. I ask none to live for me, nor do I live for any others. There is something similar there. Ultimately, he is keeping in mind his own personal interests. Paul is keeping in mind his personal interest in doing his gospel work. He's doing it because he wants a crown so that he can lay that at the feet of Jesus and hear from the Lord, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many. Come and share in your master's happiness. That's the end. That's the end to which his efforts are aimed. How consistent is that with, I ask none to live for me, nor do I live for any others? Now, that doesn't mean that you have no joy in others. The character that we're describing here has found a wife at this point already. And that's his main source of happiness in life, aside from his work. So it's not to say that we find no joy. I mean, in the Bible we hear, I have no greater joy than to see that my children are walking in the truth. Well, yes. But that's not the same thing as asking others to live for me. I don't even think that if I ask my wife or my children to live for me, that I would really be loving them. And therefore, I don't think that loving them requires that I live for them in an ultimate sense. We go on to this next paragraph, discusses the idea of justice. Very similar to John Galt's speech. I am neither foe nor friend to my brothers, but such as each of them shall deserve of me. And to earn my love, my brothers must do more than to have been born. I do not grant my love without reason, nor to any chance passer-by who may wish to claim it. I honor men with my love, but honor is a thing to be earned. We could say a lot about that. We don't have to go into great detail, but I think it is consistent with Scripture. I think that there's nuance here. because there is a certain degree of honor that we give all people. But I don't disagree with what I'm reading.
Yeah, I agree. I think the what he means here by saying I don't give my love, my honor to any passerby is he's not talking about the generic love of brother, of man that we should hold as because all men are valuable, but a greater sense of honor, a greater sense of love that we reserve to those who have earned it from us, the trust that has been earned from us, the honor that we withhold for those who have performed in a superior manner than compared to others. And in many ways, unfortunately, I think our culture now expects that to be given to everyone and flattening everything out in the ejection of merit from society, and expects the highest honor to be. I heard just recently this week someone say we went wrong whenever everyone decided that they should be in the parade and no one should have to watch. And I think that's a bit of what he's getting at here.
We have from the Bible that elders who rule well are worthy of double honor, and that probably means double pay as well as double praise. The Bible is certainly not the kind of thing that tells us to flatten out all hierarchy, like Beth Moore or J.D. Greer would say. Well, let's go to the next part. In the temple of his spirit, each man is alone. That is a powerful line. In the temple of his spirit, each man is alone. And I would keep that as something that you could use in discussions with people when they try to be controlling upon your life. He says, let each man keep his temple untouched and undefiled. Then let him join hands with others if he wishes, but only beyond his holy threshold. Not every thought that you have in your own mind belongs to other people, and it doesn't need to. And to those people over the last couple of years that have been saying, we're all in this together, compare that to, let each man keep his temple untouched, let him join hands with others if he wishes. He says, for the word we must never be spoken, save by one's choice and as a second thought. The word we is the word by which the depraved steal the virtue of the good. What is my joy if all hands, even the unclean, can reach into it? If you've read the climax of Atlas Shrugged, you'll see there's quite some similarities because John Galt has a building that he's created, actually two different ones, that have a lock on them, and there's a threshold there, and you cannot get in unless it's on his terms. Well, this reading concludes, I am done with the monster of we, the word of serfdom, of plunder, of misery, falsehood, and shame. This is the part that is most controversial in all of the things we'll say today. He says, and now I see the face of God, and I raise this God over the earth, this God whom men have sought since men came into being, this God who will grant them joy and peace and pride, this God, this one word, I. So that strikes as almost reminiscent of Lucifer raising himself up against God and trying to be his equal. So I don't think a Christian would write this. I just don't think a Christian would. And I think that as a Christian, when I read this, I think, okay, I understand the error that you're fighting against and that you are using a poetic expression to fight against the error. And I can agree with your assessment of the error. I don't agree with calling myself a god, although you could compare, ye are gods. You know, if you look up gotquestions.com, Jesus says, you are gods. What does that mean? There is something that we should discuss about the resemblance between man and God, and us being small gods. That is, we have intellect, we have power, we have a domain under us. Adam was originally God's vice-regent. Not a regent, but a vice-regent. So there's a comparison to make there. But there's also significant problems. Think about the name Michael. Who is like God? That's a question. Michael the Archangel. Well, the answer is that ultimately no one. Only to a little bit. In some ways, in limited ways analogically, but the answer is no one is really like God. So I just, as a Christian, I disagree with this. Nevertheless, I can recognize its artistic merit. Just as Leonard Peikoff said, there is value in great false art sometimes. Let's go to the next reading. There's two more readings. There's the Fountainhead, discussion between two characters. So this is on 68 for me. In the Fountainhead, we are reading the story of Howard Rourke, an architect who was doing things his own way. And this book was published in 1943. Its theme is individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in man's soul. So similar themes. First, we got the political in We the Living, and then in Anthem, we have more of a metaphysical question of, is there such thing as me? And now we're going into more of the realm of ethics. How does an individual man choose to live his life in the world? So this is individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in man's soul, his motives, the psychological motivations and the basic premises that produce the character of an individualist or a collectivist. So this is the career of Howard Rourke, an architect and innovator who breaks with tradition, recognizes no authority but that of his own independent judgment, struggles for integrity of his creative work against every form of social opposition, and wins. This is two men talking together, Rourke, the architect, and his friend Gail Wynand. Rourke is speaking here. It's what I couldn't understand about people for a long time. They have no self. They live within others. They live second-hand. He discusses a mutual acquaintance of theirs named Peter Keating, an archetype for the second-hander, someone who seeks to do what he thinks other people would want. He didn't want to be great, but to be thought great. He didn't want to build, but to be admired as a builder. He borrowed from others in order to make an impression on others. There's your actual selflessness. It's his ego that he betrayed and has given up. But everyone calls him selfish. Isn't that the root of every despicable action? Not selfishness, but precisely the absence of self. Quite a shocking twist. When I was 18, I read this book, and I realized, she is undoing everything I know about these issues. She is challenging it to the root. Her thesis here seems to be that self-interest is good, and that actually there are people who try to live by the standards of others unthinkingly, and that's the source of a lot of the wickedness in the world. So I would describe Peter Keating's personality as being the conventionalist. He's just following convention, and that seems to be his source of what he thinks reality is. So discussing these conventionalists, they have no concern for facts, ideas, work. They're concerned only with people. They don't ask, is this true? They ask, is this what others think is true? Not to judge, but to repeat. Not to do, but to give the impression of doing. Not creation, but show. If you've ever interacted with people on Twitter about a political battle and you've said, but this is true, and people said to you, but you can't say that because these are going to be the consequences of it if you say it, or because people won't like it if you say it. Say, well, maybe you and I could just one-on-one have a open, honest discussion about what's true, and then later we could discuss those concerns. So, you don't think through another's brain, he says, and you don't work through another's hands. Second-handers have no sense of reality. The second-hander acts, I've skipped ahead, but the source of his actions is scattered in every other living person. It's everywhere and nowhere, and you can't reason with him. Now, if you've ever tried to interact with a second-hander who was a pastor or a religious leader, you will know this experience. You cannot reason with them because their source of reality is not the same as your source of reality. Notice how they'll accept anything except a man who stands alone. They recognize him at once. There's a special insidious kind of hatred for him. They forgive criminals. Notice the malice toward an independent man. This idea of forgiving everything except for success. A common theme in Rand's work. Skipping ahead, look at everyone around us. You've wondered why they suffer, why they seek happiness and never find it. If any man stopped and asked himself whether he'd ever held a truly personal desire, he'd find the answer. This strongly resembles the work of C.S. Lewis, where he talks about the people who are content making pies in the mud. And they haven't set their desire high enough. The problem is that they are fooling around with temptations like alcohol and sex, or whatever small-minded vice. But they've never really set their mind on what would truly make them happy. At the bottom of this page, I think the only cardinal evil on earth is that of placing your prime concern within other men. And then, very similar to the last segment, he says, I choose my friends by that, and I know what it is. It is a self-sufficient ego. Nothing else matters. So people that have very different values can be friends if they recognize something like that, like a self-sufficient ego in the other person. So that's as far as we go on that reading from Howard Rourke. There will be more from Rourke next week, but any comments on Rourke's ideas here?
I mean, what you just described, in this speech, or what you just read, I should say, it sounds a lot like what we see in the church. I mean, it sounds like a lot of people within the church, they just float around believing whatever ideas are being espoused. And it's like, well, if they're being espoused within the confines of the four walls of the church, then they must be true. Everybody is accepting them. And I think it takes us back to what Paul said, where he talked about my children walking in the truth. He said he wanted his children to be walking in the truth, not walking in getting along with everybody. The so-called unity that, people want to preach these days.
It's definitely been my favorite reading thus far in this book. And I've actually found it quite moving simply because it echoes so much of my experience in various churches I have worked in, and in fact had to leave, had to step down from positions, had to lose even jobs because I observed something, found what I believe to be the truth, attached myself to that, and refused to give that up. As Luther said, unless good scripture or good reason convinces me to do otherwise, God help me. And when he says that the second-handers have no sense of reality, that's the emptiness I couldn't understand in people. That's what stopped me whenever I faced a committee. Men without an ego, opinion without a rational process, motion without brakes or motor, power without responsibility. And that echoes so perfectly my experience sitting in front of actual boards, elder boards of churches, in particular business meetings where I've been answering objections for an hour and they have not been able to answer any of my objections. And yet what always happens is they default to, this isn't the way we do things, or, well, who else believes what you believe? Regardless of the fact that in a lot of cases it's, the majority of Christians in church history, but usually it's always a default to tradition, to the majority, just the tyranny of the majority. And it's too many pastors I've seen who will come to me later and say, hey, I respect you for, I disagree, but I respect that you're willing to stand on this when clearly everyone hates you for it. And the others almost seem to take a personal offense to the fact. It almost seems like there's a sense of self. They're actually threatened personally. Like they have an emotional reaction that makes no sense in what should be a simple logical discussion over facts. But they have an emotional reaction, a kind of fragility that reveals they actually personally, their sense of self feels threatened because there is someone questioning what they've always held to be a doctrine or a belief that is simply true. And it really reveals, I think, a weakness, unexamined doubt that they've shoved back and not want to look at. And it threatens them that someone is actually willing to endure abuse, verbal abuse or mischaracterization and slander for an idea that when they would never do that. And simply, unfortunately, this is just way too common in the church. There are even pastors who say, the facts seem to lay that out, but I don't know anyone else who believes this. And they'll actually admit they need to know some other pastors who agree, who are all willing to go public before them, right? Before they do this. And it's essentially cowardice, unfortunately.
It's the social metaphysic. It's true because other people say it's true and only if they do. And so it makes me think of this Ayn Rand Institute video I saw this week. I think it was from Ben Bayer. And he had a thesis that the genealogy of altruism is what you were just describing, Ryan, which is people will have a method of reaching the truth, a method that they realize is not honest on some level. And they have to subvert that discovery. They have to hide from themselves, rationalize away from themselves this sense that they are not playing fair. And one of the ways they do that is by lying about their own motives. And this doctrine of altruism, which is it's related to the social metaphysic and to otherism, this other orientation, it allows them to rationalize. That's one of the things that anybody that has done something that's immoral will almost always try to say, well, I did it for some other good reason, and it's not about me. This is almost like a trope. If you think about sitcoms, somebody trying to justify their bad behavior by saying, well, I did it for somebody else, as if that would take away their guilt. And so there's a structure psychologically. And I think that video would be useful to look at.
I think one thing Rand saw, even if she, at least in the passages we've read thus far, hasn't connected each of these dots, that social metaphysic is connected to that altruism, which is connected to the totalitarianism, the collectivism that she was against as well, because those two things, the social metaphysic and that pathological altruism, as you call it, seed the ground for collectivism, for totalitarianism. And I've recently been reading a book by Kai Strittmatter, We Have Been Harmonized, about the current social credit system that's being put into place in China. And in one chapter, he says, he quotes an activist who says, because thinking in a country like this, it makes sense to deliberately steer clear of information, because thinking leads to understanding, and understanding only leads to trouble. The truly unlucky people in this system are the ones who have seen through it. The best thing is to carry on being one of those people who walk through life in a fog of confusion, and then you're safe. And he says he visited Taiwan with a group of Chinese tourists at one point, and they ran into an anti-CCP activist, member, I think, of the Falun Gong group. And they had on billboards pictures of atrocities that the Chinese government had perpetrated. And one of the tourists literally turned away, closed her eyes, clapped her hands over her ears, and started yelling, "I see nothing, I see nothing." And it reminds me of the kind of willful, intentional even, ignorance, cultivated ignorance of many Americans, obviously, of the past 2 years, as well as many, unfortunately, Christians and Christian pastors who know that knowing the truth is going to cost them, and so they intentionally seek to not be exposed to that truth. And it's in people who otherwise tend to be intellectual and well informed, but then suddenly now will sometimes say something to me like, "Oh, come on, kids being mutilated is not really happening." And when I tell them, yeah, actually the statistics are that it's in the 400s at this point, at least that we know of, in reported figures in the States, and give them the data, they're blown away and quickly change the subject. And anyway, I just thought that reading is connected to what we're discussing.
That's a great connection. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah. Hope you don't mind the selfish plug here. I got a upcoming novel. It's called Broken Mirror, and in that novel you have a pastor who preaches, a sermon saying, you can believe whatever you want about politics. We'll all hold hands and call ourselves Christians. And it's a very impassioned sermon, if I do say so myself. And then later, this angelic figure comes up to him and takes basically like these two hot coals in his hand, which is, it's supposed to mirror something in the Bible. But instead of putting these coals on his tongue, he puts them over his eyes so that he can no longer turn a blind eye to the things that are going on all around him. And I think that's basically what we're seeing in a lot of churches, with pastors especially, with Christians, and these pastors most of all, where they're turning blind eyes away from the evil in this world and saying, oh, well, we all just have disagreements. Oh, let's all hold hands and have unity. We're all one family, even if we don't agree politically. And, by politics, what do we mean? We mean killing babies. We mean castrating little boys. We mean cutting the breasts off of teenage girls. And if we were talking about this about what was going on like maybe 30 years ago. Saying, oh, well, I agree with this war, I don't agree with that war, or I think that the road should be paved green, or I think they should be paved blue. I mean, if it was stuff like that, then it's like, who cares? It's like arguing about your favorite football team, but we're not at that point anymore. Where we've come is just way, way, way too far.
There was this idea of we have been harmonized. I couldn't help but think of the connection between that and one of the inventions in Atlas Shrugged, which was called the Thomson Harmonizer, which was a doomsday device, kind of analogous to nuclear bomb, and it was going to be used to end civil unrest. It was a weapon to be used by the United States government against its own people. Well, let's go forward into the reading. This is the last reading today. This is called The Soul of a Collectivist. This excerpt is the confession of Rourke's antipode and arch enemy, Ellsworth M. Toohey, an architectural critic and sociologist who spends his life plotting the future establishment of a collectivist society. He is addressing one of his own victims. So this is him talking to Peter Keating. So I'm just going to read at the end of the first paragraph. He says, I shall rule. It's only a matter of discovering the lever. If you learn how to rule one single man's soul, you can get the rest of mankind. Skipping ahead, you won't need a whip. He'll bring it to you, and he'll ask to be whipped. Want to know how it's done? He says there are many ways, and I'm going to list out 3 or 4 different ways. So, A. Make man feel small. Make him feel guilty. Kill his aspiration and his integrity. Kill integrity by internal corruption. This is the key, is those who try to control other people, the totalitarians, they will try to corrupt the people. When someone is corrupted, then they can be controlled. Use it against itself. Direct it toward a goal destructive of all integrity. Preach selflessness. Tell man that he must live for others. Tell men that altruism is the ideal. Not a single one of them has ever achieved it, and not a single one ever will. His every living instinct screams against it, but don't you see what you accomplish? Man realizes that he's incapable of what he has accepted as the noblest virtue, and it gives him a sense of guilt, of sin, of his own basic unworthiness. Since the supreme ideal is beyond his grasp, he gives up. Eventually all ideals, all aspiration, all sense of his personal value. He feels himself obliged to preach what he can't practice. His soul gives up self-respect. You've got him, he'll obey. He'll be glad to obey, because he can't trust himself. He feels uncertain. He feels unclean. That's one way. All right, now we go to B. This is another way that totalitarians will control people. Kill a man's sense of values. Kill his capacity to recognize greatness or to achieve it. Don't deny the conception of greatness. Destroy it from within. The great is the rare, the difficult, the exceptional. Set up standards of achievement open to all, to the least, to the most inept. And he says, don't set out to raise all shrines, you'll frighten men. Enshrine mediocrity, and the shrines are raised. Now we see this in the media today. No doubt about that. All right, he says there's another way. So this would be C. Another way that totalitarians control people. Kill by laughter. Laughter is an instrument of human joy. Learn to use it as a weapon of destruction. Turn it into a sneer. Tell them to laugh at everything. Tell them that a sense of humor is an unlimited virtue. Don't let anything remain sacred in a man's soul, and his soul won't be sacred to him. Kill reverence, and you've killed the hero in man. I can see a lot of that in the cynicism today. All right, D. He says, here is another way. This is the most important. Don't allow men to be happy. Happiness is self-contained and self-sufficient. Happy men have no time and no use for you. Happy men are free men. Never let them have what they want. Make them feel that the mere fact of a personal desire is evil. Bring them to a state where saying, I want, is no longer a natural right, but a shameful admission. Growing up in a society that was generally collectivist and altruist, I felt this way. At least for part of my teenage years until I figured out what was going on. I felt insecure about the idea of wanting to be happy. Wanting to be with other people and smile and enjoy other people. I felt that there was something wrong with me because I wanted to be happy. I will never forgive my society for doing that to me. In the rest of my life, I'm clawing my way back from that false conception. And it wasn't my parents that taught it to me. It was just something I absorbed, and I don't even think my parents operated on those same premises. But it's something that motivated me to say, never let this happen again. That kind of pain deep down of realizing that your conception of values was twisted by your society, by what you accepted as true, that is enough to motivate an entire life of trying to be a guide to other people and say, stop, there's a danger here, don't fall into this ditch. That is what motivates me, is that people would not live an entire life like I was in danger of living. I'll just give one example. I played basketball, and I was such a timid person, or such a I don't want to trample on other people type of a person, that at one point my coach said, Cody, you've got to foul. Just foul the other guy. And so I remember after he said that, I was like, okay. So I went and did the dumbest foul possible. Just stuck my hand right in his chest. And it's like, no, don't foul stupidly. But I had to be told to take initiative, to be the one who dominates somebody else. I had it almost like bred out of me in my upbringing that you just don't do that. And so I realized there's something wrong with my understanding of morality. And the other guys in my basketball team didn't have that. The other guys in my basketball team were not Christians. Something about my understanding of who Jesus was had made me feel compelled that I should not be the kind of person who has an aggressive attitude toward others or an assertive attitude toward others. And I mean, it could very well be related to turn the other cheek, walk a second mile. But a misunderstanding of that will make a kid be bullied. Now, I was not bullied. I happened to be tall, and I happened to have lots of friends in school. So I never experienced bullying. But someone very close to me did. And it messed up the rest of their life for the next 2 decades. Because they understood that their role as a Christian middle schooler was to turn the other cheek. I mean, their conception of it was, I cannot stand up for myself. And as a result of I cannot stand up for myself, it led to I don't know how to respond when I'm being bullied by other boys, which led to I don't know how to make friends with boys. And if a young man doesn't know how to make friends with other boys, you know what the consequences are. And I will never forgive society for making that happen. Because they did not care enough about the truth to teach that young man that he needed to fight back for his own life and for his own sense of self-worth. We cannot let churches continue teaching this pathological altruism. And that's the whole purpose of my life. If I were to go back to the deepest motivation, what pain is deepest in your heart that you have decided that you are going to set out and you're going to slay that giant? That's the giant that I'm going to slay, and that's the reason.
Yeah, that echoes my experience quite a bit as well, simply with the with that understanding of I get what I've witnessed is that those most committed, most faithful to what they believe the Bible says tend to be the only ones who actually consistently try to put it into practice and then pay the price of the discouragement, the despair, and the logical consequences of that kind of worldview. Even most of the pastors who preach that kind of thing do not live a life devoid of ambition, do not live a life devoid of self-respect, do not live a life devoid of assertiveness. And yet the young men who hear him and who most intentionally want to put those words into practice are the ones who get the brunt of the consequences of living in that manner. And I think it's why you see so many young men today, especially young Christian men, turning to guys like Jordan Peterson or to Doug Wilson or to other guys who say, yeah, assertiveness isn't wrong, being bold isn't wrong, defending yourself isn't wrong, and masculinity isn't wrong, and even winning is not wrong, right? Even as I've heard many of them talk about, seeking the glory that is appropriate for man to seek is not wrong. And for young men who have been starved of, who have been told they need to be something different from what they are, what they know they cannot change about themselves, is incredibly damaging to their soul. And that occurred to me recently again in reading through Atlas Shrugged, and there's a moment when Reardon, the metallurgical inventor, the businessman, comes home, and it occurs to him in one moment as he's listening to his family, his mother, his wife talk about him derisively, passive-aggressively, in insulting ways. He says, it's almost like they're offended by my very existence. And then he goes, but that's crazy. And he convinces himself that can't be it. That's such a crazy thought. And in reading that made me think, man, it's like Rand has read my mind. Growing up, once again, I would echo what you said, Cody, with, it's not something I think my parents explicitly would have taught, but from a particular culture, specifically an Anabaptist Mennonite one, where I think that sort of pathological altruism and that passivity and other ideas you mentioned, I think are more explicitly taught, or more they're accentuated in that subculture. It's not taught, but it's caught, and it's incredibly damaging, especially for those like myself who had a lot of natural ability in particular activities that put you on a stage or put you in front of other people. And I remember directing a music group in college and writing a director's note to put in the program that I was asked to put in there. And a friend of mine literally said, maybe you should not refer to yourself as the director in this. And I dug in, what are you getting at? What are you saying? And he literally just had a problem with with any language that was me recognizing that I'm directing the group, that took any responsibility for what was happening in the program that I had written, that I directed, that the team I had put together. It was that any recognition period, I should say, is wrong. And it takes a long time for a kid to deprogram that way of viewing the world and that way of thinking.
Ryan was saying exactly what I was thinking. It's like, it seems like in the modern church, they regard masculinity as a sin, and it's something that's got to change. It really has to change. I mean, God made man, and God made man masculine. It seems like a lot of people get the idea that, okay, God created the daisies in the field, but they forget that God also created the grizzly bear. God is very strong, and when I read Scripture, God doesn't mince words. He's very direct and he's very clear, about the things he says and the things he means. And we see the same thing with the men of God. We see the same thing with the prophets and the apostles. They speak very clearly. They let their yes be yes and their no be no. I think that the church needs to start not only allowing but expecting men to be men, and teaching boys that, being a man is a good thing, not something to be ashamed of.
There was a post from Jacob Brunton that came up in my Facebook memories today, and it was something along the lines of, have you ever noticed how hard the church makes it for men to take a moral stand on something? And that's true. It's almost like that's the way it's been set up. Let me go on in the reading. So this is Ellsworth M. Toohey, and he's describing these ways that you crush people's souls. He says, empty man's soul and the space is yours to fill. He speaks of sacrifice, renunciation, self-denial, give up, give up, give up. Just prove that a thing makes men happy, and you've damned it. That's how far we've come. We've tied happiness to guilt. Throw your firstborn into a sacrificial furnace. Lie on a bed of nails. Go into the desert to mortify the flesh. Don't dance. Don't go to the movies on Sunday. Don't try to get rich. Don't smoke. Don't drink. It's all the same line, the great line. Notice how those were sort of the stereotypes of what the moralists and the teetotalers were saying. Every system of ethics that preached sacrifice grew into a world power and ruled millions of men. Of course, you must dress it up. You must tell people that they'll achieve a superior kind of happiness by giving up everything that makes them happy. Use big words. Universal harmony. There's that word again. Eternal spirit, divine purpose, nirvana, paradise, racial supremacy, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Internal corruption, Peter. That's the oldest one of all. And so now I think he says it's the oldest one of all, but I think what he's really doing is summarizing all four of them. Internal corruption is his method. Just listen to any prophet. If you hear him speak of sacrifice, run. Run faster than from a plague. It stands to reason that where there's sacrifice, there's someone collecting sacrificial offerings. Any man that tells me that I'm going to need a sacrifice for his cause, immediately I'm distancing myself. Like, oh, so you're the one collecting the sacrifices, I see. The man who speaks to you of sacrifice speaks of slaves and masters, and intends to be the master. If ever you hear a man telling you that you must be happy, that it's your natural right, that it's your first duty to yourself, that will be the man who's not after your soul. That will be the man who has nothing to gain from you. I'm now on page 74 in my book. Men have a weapon against you, and he speaks of what this weapon is. What's the weapon? Well, it's reason. It'd be self-assertion, but common sense. Reason. So you must be very sure to take that away from them. He says, never deny anything outright, you give your hand away. Don't say reason is evil, though some have gone that far with astonishing success. This reminds me of some of our discussions against fideism that we've had in the past. Just say that reason is limited. If you understand that Jacob and I are familiar with this book, you understand, like, we've read the playbook of everybody that is against reason. We've read the playbook. It's here. And this is why immediately we're triggered when we see somebody say, well, just put reason in its place. We're like, so don't say reason is evil, though some have gone that far with astonishing success. Just say that reason is limited. There's something above it. What? You don't need to be too clear about it either. The field's inexhaustible. Instinct, feeling, which we see in your Ram Hazoni, right? And then revelation, divine intuition, dialectical materialism. You tell him that there's something above sense, presuppositionalism. That here he must not try to think, he must feel, he must believe. This combination of the appeal to just believe, and also this idea that you shouldn't follow your own self-interest, but that seeking the interests of others is what makes things good. Those two ideas, they're in almost every Disney movie if you look for them, or any kids movie. There's always, in the end, some moment where the main character has to simply let go of his apprehension of reality and live for others. And when that happens, when he says, I'm just going to feel it, therefore it's true, the magic happens. Now, why would that be the case? Well, it's interesting because it's a twist. Good story has to have reversals, twists that you don't see coming, something that's not intuitive. And so I think that's one of the reasons why it's sort of a trope. The other reason is that people actually believe it, at least on some level. But it's being programmed into our kids in Hollywood. Can you rule a thinking man? We don't want any thinking men, says Toohey. It's the world of the future, the world of obedience and unity. A world where the thought of each man will not be his own, but an attempt to guess the thought in the brain of his neighbor. Skipping, he says, a world in which men will not work for so innocent an incentive as money, but for the headless monster, prestige, the approval of his fellows. A world with its motor cut off, and a single heart pumped by hand, my hand, in the hand of a very few, other men like me. Moving forward in the reading, he says, do you know the proper antonym for ego? Bromide, Peter. The rule of the bromide. We'll enjoy unlimited submission from men who've learned nothing except to submit. We'll call it to serve. Notice about 10 or 20 years back, the trend in the evangelical churches about servant leadership. Not to say that that's a bad concept, but when it is twisted in such a way as to deny self-assertion, to deny trying to build something of value. No, I just want to be a servant leader, and that means passivity, or that means other people set the terms of what's true and false. That's the problem. He goes on, everything that can't be ruled must go, and if freaks persist to be born on occasion, they will not survive beyond their 12th year. When their brains begin to function, they will feel the pressure and it will explode. The pressure gauged to a vacuum. Do you know the fate of a deep sea creature brought out to sunlight? So much for future Rourkes. The rest of you will smile and obey. Have you noticed that the imbecile always smiles? Man's first frown is the first touch of God on his forehead, the touch of thought. There's some perceptivity there, I would say. On page 76 is the last page in our reading today. I want my world of the future. Let all live for all. Let all sacrifice and none profit. Let all suffer and none enjoy. Let progress stop. Let all stagnate. There's equality in stagnation. So he claims that his goal is equality. He's actually a nihilist, though, and that's usually the rationalization for nihilism is equality. It's envy. Everything I said is contained in a single word: collectivism. Remember the Roman emperor who said he wished humanity had a single neck so he could cut it? We've taught men to unite. This makes one neck, ready for one leash. We've found the magic word, collectivism. Keep in mind this was published in 1943. He says, look at Europe, you fool. Can't you see past the guff and recognize the essence? One country is dedicated to the proposition that man has no rights, that the collective is all. The individual held as evil, the mass as God. No motive and no virtue permitted except that of service to the proletariat. That's one version. Here's another. A country dedicated to the proposition that man has no rights, that the state is all. The individual held as evil, the race as God. Clearly referencing Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. No motive and no virtue permitted except that of service to the race. We've fixed the coin, he says. Heads collectivism and tails collectivism. Offer poison as food and poison as antidote. Kill the individual, kill man's soul, and the rest will follow automatically. This idea of offering the poison and then offering more poison as the antidote, that reminds me of this concept of Hegelian dialectic, the idea of owning the discourse by having, what do they call it, controlled opposition. If you ever read Ender's Game, there's in one of the situations in Ender's Game, there's a brother and a sister, and they have two online personalities that are anonymous, and they fight against each other on purpose in order to move the Overton window in a certain direction. They fight with each other on purpose, but they're collaborating together, choosing your enemies and controlling your enemies, or faking like your enemy, a false flag operation. So I think it's perceptive. I think that it reflects what's going on in the national conservative movement today. If you realize that you've got people that claim to be Republicans and conservatives that are allying themselves with socialists, clearly we have a controlled opposition situation going on. And so I think that is a good place for us to leave off in the reading today. Interactions with that, I've got maybe 5 more minutes. Anyone wants to say anything else?
Yeah, I'm definitely a fan of Ender's Game, and I know what you're referring to. I think we see this a lot in today's so-called right-wing politics, where on one hand we have the left, which is absolutely insane, and on the other hand we're seeing the rise of this rightism or this right-wing collectivism or right-wing socialism, whatever you want to call it, and that's not a good thing. We have to have it. We have to be smarter than the left, yes, who have anti-reason, but just being smarter than the left isn't enough. A box of rocks is smarter than the left. A box of rocks has zero intelligence, which is more than negative intelligence. What we need to have is, we need to have a rational morality, we need to have a rational philosophy, and we need to be able to stand on our own 2 feet as men and think with our God-given brains.
Everybody that is interested in these discussions, especially if you have a podcast or a blog or if you're on Twitter, seek honest methods, rational methods. Be careful what you are agreeing with and be willing to critique your own side. Well, this matters. Ayn Rand's perceptiveness is going to be useful to us because these things point out some of the underlying mechanisms by which deception takes place in society. And we as Christians can appreciate that even if we don't agree with Rand on many other things. Well, we're going to continue next week to discuss these speeches. It'll be Howard Rourke's Fountainhead Courtroom speech. Thank you for joining us for this meeting of the New Intellectual Book Study. Please give this a like or a share. It helps us, and you can find a list of the readings and our video replays if you go to christianintellectual.com/intellectual. I also would like you to consider supporting for the New Christian Intellectual by becoming a donor. You can do that at christianintellectual.com/Patreon. We are equipping Christians to be defenders of reason, individualism, and capitalism. And through this work, we are aiming to create a new American Renaissance. I look forward to talking with you again. God bless.